everybody. Welcome back to the How to Get an Analytics Job podcast. For all of you who missed that intro, it's back as well. And today we're joined by three beautiful people. We've got two of our apprentices, Drew and Joel, and then we've got Michael Galarnyk. So, Michael, welcome back to the podcast because this makes, I think, your fourth appearance on our podcast.
Wow, a couple times. I'm happy to
Yeah.
be back. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, for our viewers who aren't familiar with who you are and what you do, who are you and what do you do?
So, who I am and what I do changes over time, just like everyone else. Um, so, I'm a data scientist by training, in some sense of the word. And these days, I've gone more into like content marketing, and I can kind of go into how I got where I am. I think is probably a good story because most people that are in analytics, data science, whatever, they typically don't go in a very like straight path to where they want to go. A lot of people also don't know where they want to go. I didn't know how I wanted to get anywhere. I didn't know what I wanted to do. So for a little context, I graduated with a bachelor's in nanoengineering from UC San Diego, which is essentially like microfluidics, steering red blood cells with ultrasound, a bunch of different things. And throughout some of my research, if you're curious, you can Google it, I guess. I really kind of discovered I like playing with data, and there's a lot of things you can automate with data and showcase to people that can really add a lot of value and drive results. So I decided to get a master's in data science from UC San Diego. And then during that time, one thing I kind of realized is it wasn't enough just going to school and just getting good grades or whatever. I had to actually have some proof I could actually do something. So during master's, because I wasn't getting a lot of like hits for jobs, or people weren't interested in interviewing me, people thought I didn't have skills or whatever, because I had no actual proof that I could actually do what I could say I could do. So then during my time at UC San Diego for my master's, I worked as a data scientist at Scripps Research. Before that, during the master's, I started interning at CME Group, Uptake. I worked at Cymer, which is essentially building lasers, which is kind of cool. And I did a bunch of other things as well. And then during all that time, while I was doing my master's, some of this stuff kind of overlapped my undergrad, by the way. I started a blog, and it was like a Python blog, a data analysis blog. I created a blog. People reached out to me about making courses because they like my blog, and I started making LinkedIn Learning courses, and it kind of escalated from there. And then eventually, after making all this content, I kind of got into developer relations, which is like getting people to like your software or be aware of your software. It was open source software that had like essentially freemium software. And then eventually through all that, I got into marketing because I started writing all my blogs eventually added up to the point where people saw that I get people to view content. So I got into marketing. And so a lot of my job now is taking campaigns or writing content, getting views for that content, and then in some cases, seeing if that translates to sales or not. Because the goal is not always just to get sales. Sometimes you have content to get people to want to apply to your company. Sometimes it's content for other purposes as well. It's not just to make sales, which is something I didn't think of in the past.
You know, something that you share in common with a lot of our guests is that you have an extremely diverse work experience. You find that often plays a pretty big part in, what you do at your current job, whatever that might be.
I think a lot of experience is very synergistic, even if you don't see your experience being synergistic initially. I do think some people try to stay too close to their home field if they go into analytics, for example. So if like someone has a degree in biology, they might be like, oh, I want to work for a biology company and do analytics for them. And they very much limit themselves to their past domain or past experience. But a lot of the skills from different jobs are transferable. So like even right now, even though my audio may not be perfect, my experience making YouTube content is actually useful for marketing because I can edit videos, I can have not the worst audio, just bad audio, I guess. And a lot of stuff really adds. So like my experience making blogs about like Python or setting up something in Tableau or whatever, I've actually used that in my marketing job. And that's made me more efficient, and it helped me get where I am today.
You've used Tableau in your current marketing job.
I've had to, yeah.
What
Not much.
what for?
Very
I ask, just like generally.
well, if you want to kind of look at like how effective a marketing campaign is, it helps to have visuals. Um, am I doing anything crazy? No. Am I doing anything crazy with Python these days in my job? Yeah, a little bit. But a lot of it is really just can you pick up a tool for a use case that you currently have and then translate it to business value.
Right.
So making a marketing dashboard, for example, very useful to kind of see what's working and what is clearly not working and then kind of visualize it. Because if you just have raw numbers, sometimes it's not very useful.
Yeah, and the thing is it's like you're not even specifically focused on knowing how to use the tools because those
Mhm,
are constantly evolving in the
mhm.
data sphere. You're more focusing on the applications of them and
Yeah.
what can I actually use them for? What can I make? What useful thing can I make with this?
Yeah, and the one difference between being on the job versus not being on the job, when sometimes when you're on the job, it's quick and dirty. If it's just for an internal sort of thing, or your own personal use case, if you're doing something for like an interview or you're doing something for your public portfolio, the stuff in your portfolio has to be flawless or as
Right.
close to flawless as possible because you want to put your best foot forward because that is something that you want to prepare for interviews or to have your name out there. Versus on the job, sometimes it's like I gotta get this task done. I gotta hit my OKR or my goal or whatever. Um, and then versus the job, it's something that you continuously iterate on for a portfolio for like getting interviews and stuff. That's something you should iterate on based on interview feedback or lack thereof, and kind of build yourself out there.
Right. And I was going to say, you mentioned the word perfect. I don't necessarily think that everything you have to put out there on your public portfolio has to be perfect. I think that when you're going into an interview setting, what you take into that setting should be perfect. That should be
Hmm.
a completed project, something that you can feel really confident talking
Hmm.
about. But as far as getting your name out there, I think
Hmm.
the more work that you show, the better. What would you say about that?
So when you initially start, I believe you need to get things out as quick and dirty as possible. Like get something out there. Having something is better than absolutely nothing. And that's something I think a lot of people kind of have a blockage, whether it's a mental block or it's something else. Sometimes just getting something out there is so much better than having nothing because then you can show the interviewer, hey, I've actually done something. And they'll be like, oh, I see you have, a skill. Maybe it's a C skill versus an A skill, maybe, but it shows actual competency. And then based on that interview, kind of iterate, or based on someone looking at a dashboard on a podcast or something, um, then you improve it.
Right.
Yeah.
We are kind of jumping ahead a little bit because we're
Yeah.
assuming that the person has already got the in an interview setting
Yeah.
gotten the best foot forward
Hmm.
already. What about for those people who maybe haven't quite gotten their foot in the door yet? They've done the work
Hmm.
and they're starting the networking phase because I think this
Hmm.
is where Drew and Joel, you guys are at right now.
Hmm.
Is you've done the work, you've got your network built up, and now it's the next step is finding somebody who you can really get close with, either a mentor or a hiring manager or something like that. How do you find people like that?
Well, how do I find people if I'm looking to hire, or is it finding people
I
if you're
suppose
looking for a job yourself?
I suppose a better way to ask this question is if you're looking for a job yourself, how do you find somebody who is extremely interested in you?
Well, I think the biggest thing is making it as easy as possible for the person to either refer you or to think that you're a quality candidate. So that is having something public that you can quickly share a link of when you're like, hey, I'm looking for a job if you're networking or whatever. Or someone talks to you like, hey, what are you doing? Are you looking for a job? What skills do you have? And you're like, oh, I can send you that dashboard. I can send you a link if you're, let's say, more on the programming end of the analytics. I can send you a Jupyter notebook of my code analysis or Kaggle kernel or whatever. That makes it so much easier for people to think you have skills. And it's a lot more social proof that people eventually will reach out to you rather than the other way around if you have a big enough presence. Or
So
even,
you need to build authorities to a certain aspect, right?
yeah, I mean, you can't just say something. Um, it doesn't always work that way. It's possible. Sometimes you can say something to believe you, but having amazing things to show people it makes it so much easier to get your foot in the door.
Right. Yeah, I understand that completely,
Mhm.
and I'm sure that Drew and Joel, you guys can probably agree with this. Well, how do you guys feel comfortable where you've started in the analytics space? You know, you've gone through the Silvertone Analytics program. That was a 4-week experience, and that was very iterative as well, where we take a week by week approach, and you try to build on what you did the previous week. Do you feel like that's been successful for you thus far? Do you feel like there's any places that maybe you still need to work on?
Well, I feel like the nice thing is that each week you're kind of working with a different tool. I think one mistake that a lot of people make is they get stuck on a tool for like a month or two. I honestly think you just need to dive into a couple tools, start off with one tool one week, go on to another tool next week, and just get an extremely introductory knowledge of a certain tool. And then after you kind of have the introduction to a lot of the main tools you're going to be using, then you kind of can go on to that intermediate phase and then just keep on building from there and then decide what tool you like and then go into maybe an advanced stage in that tool. But I would say I kind of slowed myself down by saying, let's study this for a month or two when I should have kind of looked at it, moved on, looked at something else, and then circled back to what I wanted to learn more in depth.
Yeah, I think it's important to know enough to be dangerous in a couple of areas. It's nice to have a full toolbox to utilize, because what a lot of people fall into is the specialist trap. Where
Yeah.
you brand yourself as, oh, I'm a Tableau specialist, I'm a Power BI specialist, and Michael, I want to know your thoughts on that. What's your
Mhm.
thoughts on specializing in something?
So a couple things. So whatever tool you choose, it's about solving a problem. So sometimes having a wide knowledge of just tools in general, or having used one once or twice or a couple times, is really good, because then you can be like, oh, I can do this in this tool a lot easier than this tool, and you can actually get value. And then that way is also it's also good for like interview questions. So if someone asks like, oh yeah, like, hey, why'd you choose this tool versus this tool? Um, that also comes up quite often. Um, but once you have that kind of introductory like wide net, you kind of want to specialize just a little bit, or have some project that's more in depth, and at least one tool. It could be multiple tools. Um, I think one thing I've seen that's kind of cool some people have done is they do one project in one tool, and they do the exact same project in another tool. That's a really good learning experience. I've seen someone do that for like a job one time. I was really impressed.
Yeah, well,
Um,
and you're telling that story right now, so it's
yeah.
like that person who interviewed with you
Mhm.
is still in your head. How many years ago? I mean,
That's like 4 years ago.
yeah. I mean, do you
I'm
even
old.
know? It's like, well, that's just an example. I mean, you just gave an example of how to stick in
Mhm.
an interviewer's head.
Yeah.
Can you think of any other ways? Because I think that's what the key is to getting hired, is really becoming memorable.
I think a lot of it is when you go through resumes, and I don't do a ton of hiring at this current job because I just started. I can talk about what I do later if you like. But I think a big thing is having some proof on a resume or some link to something, because it's really hard when you're just looking through resumes to kind of be like, oh, does this person actually know what they're talking about? Is there some way they're an authority on this? Are they authentic? Because resumes all read the same, but there's a link. You're like, oh, this person's kind of cool, or this person has something to show. So I at least know that's a checkbox. Oh, they know that what they're talking about, or they can actually show something. I think that's the resumes that really like stick out to me. I don't like when people are like, I'm a highly motivated, skilled, and whatever, and I'm like,
Everyone's highly
okay,
motivated.
everyone's highly
Everyone's highly
motivated.
motivated. If you're applying for jobs, that is you being highly motivated right there.
Or like, I'm interested in like resumes. It really helps when, first of all, people have a structured resume. There's a link to something they've actually done. There's some proof. I know a lot of people say like, oh, a lot of work I've done is not allowed to be shared. Well, if you're looking for a job and it's taking 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, when you're looking for a job, part of your job could be building a public presence. And it's hard because that's not really paid work necessarily up front, but it's kind of investing in making an online presence.
Right.
And it's a really hard concept for people, because if you're just applying for jobs, doing the same thing month after month after month,
And
then
expecting a different result.
expecting for results, then that's not always a great idea.
The
It's an
definition of
approach.
insanity.
I do like the hustle.
Yeah.
I've one summer when I was in undergrad, I applied for like 300, 500, something crazy internships. And I was doing the same resume, the same bad old nanoengineering resume. And I landed up interning at NASA. And that was the only interview I got. The only one. And it was because I was at UC San Diego, and it was a program actually for UC Santa Cruz. And I don't know how that happened, but I somehow got in that program, and I made basically minimum wage, if that, on like a fellowship. But anyway, so hustle is very important. Whenever
Well, you bring up a valid point with education. It's that when you were starting your career, you didn't instantly launch into a $70,000-$80,000 a year analytics job. You had to take one step backwards before you could take two forwards.
Yeah, there was a lot of weird steps. It was windy.
A lot of weird steps?
A lot of weird, windy steps.
Any that you would care to elaborate on?
So, I mean, I can talk about like where I currently am, because I maybe started a little bit more analytics based, and then I went to data science, and then I've kind of gone to marketing data science, I guess, or marketing data analytics, depending on how you want to say. But back when I first started like going more into the teaching, I did some teaching at UC San Diego Extension, and then I wanted to make a class for Stanford Human Studies at the time. It was like a basic machine learning class, like basic. And I didn't have the time to make the class and still have a full-time job. And I made the not necessarily the smartest decision to quit my job at Scripps Research Translational Institute, where I was doing a lot of like research on like wearable devices like Fitbits and stuff. And I still wear my Fitbit today, ironically, in January 2020 to make this course. And I figured, it would take, let's say 4 weeks. It ended up taking like 8 weeks. By then COVID started, and it was a bit harder to get a job because I was still consulting on that side, so still making some money. But I quit that job to start teaching. And after that, it took a while to kind of find a full-time job that was good for my career, so to speak. Because I quit a job to make a course, which actually ended up being really good for my career in the long run, surprisingly. But I turned down my salary to go make a course that had delayed income.
Well, it's all where you value your time. So it's like, do you value your time more in the future, or would you rather have a more immediate return? Oftentimes that depends on the person, but oftentimes it also just depends on whatever the return on investment is for whatever you're deciding to do other than the other thing. I'll give another example similar to, it's actually very similar. It reminded me of when you were talking of this use case. Gabrielle, she was on the podcast a little while back, and she was also in our apprenticeship cohort. She was a single mother, and she had decided to quit her full-time job as well to fully engage with our course. And when she got out of our course, she ended up making significantly more, actually $50,000 more than she was before she came in our course. But it's about the dedication is what it is. It's being dedicated to, I need to improve. And it's finding the areas that you're weak in. That's difficult. What do you struggle with that as well? Like figuring out exactly what you don't know, because sometimes it can be really easy to know what you know.
I mean, initially, I thought I knew a lot of stuff when I first came out of school, or interning or whatever. And now I realize I know nothing. I know very little. I don't know if that's where you want to go with the question, but
I mean, pretty much.
I think it's like you kind of hinted. It's recognizing what you don't know, and how, at least when I was interviewing, how to show people that I've made effort to fill in the gaps, if that makes sense. So like when I first started jobs, yes, I could manipulate data in, let's say, Python or Tableau, but I wasn't great about getting the data into tools efficiently. So often data was stored in databases. So I kind of realized that and kind of worked on my SQL queries and stuff like that. And I realized there's no proof I knew that. So then I, worked on some like basic public portfolio content and all that sort of stuff. So it's not always easy to recognize your faults, because we have so many. I have more than I'd say most people. But recognizing your faults and kind of filling those gaps in your public presence is really important.
Yeah, and as far as being able to show, like maybe some people are saying they're not able to show the work that they do.
Hmm.
Um, Showing part of the work that you say you can
Hmm.
do
Yeah.
builds that rapport for you, because it's
Yeah.
like if you're saying you can do this and then you're saying you can do another thing
Hmm.
and you don't prove that you can do the first thing, how am I supposed to believe that you can do SQL code?
Yeah, it's really sad. But that's at least the process, especially if you're looking for a job and you know it'll take a while. While you're applying for jobs, most people have some downtime,
Mhm.
um, or they can make an hour or whatever, work on the kind of public presence stuff, or work on interview questions that you failed on in the past. If you've gotten interviews, is really important as well. I'm going all over the place here, kind of like my career, but these are really, really important things. Um, so publicly showing something, making some, dummy sort of thing to show online is really good. Because also you learn something in the process too by kind of firming up your gaps.
Right.
And so if someone asks you, have you done this before in an interview? And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, we decided to go another way with someone more experienced in X. Well, when I fail that kind of interview for X, I work on X and I show X somewhere or another. So one comment people had for me before I started a job in developer relations is like, hey, you don't make a lot of advanced content. So I started making more advanced content for some stuff. And then that helped me get the job one job I got, and then that helped me get a different job, and so on and so forth. It's very additive. Because
Mhm.
like when you make content for one job often, it often helps you, a job or two down the line, if that makes sense.
Right. You
'Cause
just
it
start
doesn't go away.
you start referencing yourself.
Yeah,
That's
pretty
that's
much.
that's I mean that's the ideal though, is you're
Yeah.
able to confidently
Hmm.
uh, say, "Oh, I did this before. Let me just go back and grab that."
Yeah, even if it doesn't seem very relevant at the time, or may not seem relevant, how is this relevant 3 years from now? Sometimes it can be, and it's really helpful to kind of pick that back up. So
From an
like,
organization perspective, from an like staying organized
mhm,
perspective, I mean,
yeah,
is that do you have any recommendations on how to
stay
make
organized with your
yeah,
content,
yeah,
or
yeah.
stay organized with anything.
Well,
Um,
with your, I suppose with your content, yeah, because
so there's a lot of different ways to kind of approach this. So if you have a lot of low quality content, I really believe in having a couple strong pieces to kind of refer back to, because the really strong stuff you do is going to be referenceable for years and years and years. Like I have some publications for my undergrad, and a lot of things that I used to care about, like grades and stuff, no one cares what my undergrad grades were. My publications, though, they're there forever, whether I want them to be or not. So that's something I can reference if someone's like, hey, do you have experience writing technical content that's academic in nature? It's like, okay, sure. My publications are on Google Scholar. You can look them up.
Mhm.
Or I have some old blogs about like box plots, for example, something really simple. Um, but I did a really good job on that. I can reference that forever because it's pretty clean content. And I've moved it from different sites over time, maybe, but I can still reference it.
Mhm.
And that's the basic thing for content. Same thing with dashboards. If you have something on Tableau Public, if it still exists, you can kind of have that forever. Or if you made a video about your dashboard and put it on YouTube, even if you put it unlisted or whatever, you can always reference something later on down the road.
Mhm.
These are really, really valuable things to have. And as far as organization, um, I believe simple file systems work pretty well on your computer. If you're in the coding realm where you're not necessarily using BI tools, having a GitHub, if you're coding in Python or R or whatever, is very nice. And then having a README that explains what you're doing or what you did is nice, because you'll forget what you did 5 years ago. I promise you. I forgot what I did yesterday for work. So organization helps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Mhm.
So we've kind of covered a range of topics here, and I
Yeah.
want to bring it back to the interview process. We talked about
Mhm.
personal branding. We
Yeah.
talked about how to get your name in front of an interviewer. Now, let's say you've gotten the interview,
Mhm.
and you're getting ready for like an informal
Mhm.
interview setting.
Mhm.
From an interviewer's perspective, how do you expect those calls to go?
So, one really important thing, and I think everyone's kind of mentioned this if they've been on this podcast or anywhere else, is it's nice if someone did some research. And I know if you have like 10 different interviews, it's really hard to do research. And this happens sometimes, especially when the job market was really hot, like a couple months ago or 6 months ago, a year, depending on how you want to see it. If people did research in the company, what we're trying to accomplish, why we're trying to accomplish it, and kind of what the job description is, because oftentimes, and this sounds crazy unless you had a lot of interviews or in case you forgot what you applied for, which happens all the time, they didn't read the job description, or they don't remember the job description. So I recommend you kind of save a PDF of that in case it disappears later on. It's nice time people do the research, know what's going on. So those are things I'm kind of looking for. Is someone punctual? Are they on time? Like, are they, happy to be there? Are they excited? Those are things that are like positive signs, and those are things that anyone can really do. Punctuality is something, things happen sometimes, and that's kind of unfair, but that's things people are looking for.
Yeah. Before we hopped on the podcast here, you were mentioning how you felt sometimes interview questions were unfair.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
What did you mean by that?
Okay, so oftentimes people ask, first of all, sometimes people don't want to hire the candidate on the phone. Like, that's just kind of a fact of life. They have a friend they want to hire, or they're doing an interview even though they have an internal candidate, but they have to legally do it or whatever. So people might make the interviews a bit harder for certain people versus others, which is horrible. And that's bias, and there's a lot of horrible things people do, but that's one of them. Mm-hmm. It's like a courtesy interview. I've literally been the person being interviewed where it was clear they're interviewing me as a courtesy. Mm-hmm. And then other things are sometimes people will ask you questions about problems they're actually trying to solve themselves. So, like, currently I'm trying to, tie like people viewing our website and increases in people viewing our websites due to content to sales.
This is for your current job?
Let's say it is. Okay. I can't say exactly what I do.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
It's
for a job.
Yeah, it's for a job. I have a lot of jobs, but it's for a job, and it's not an easy task. Sometimes people hire people to solve problems they can't solve themselves. So if it's, tying that to sales, or tying content to people reaching out about jobs, or it's tying, X to Y, it's not always an easy kind of connection. Versus oftentimes in data you find online, it's pretty clear. You have a nice clean data set, you have something, and it's pretty clear what you want to accomplish. Sometimes someone's like, hey, I have this data set. What can you do with it? Well, honestly, I might not know. Like, I'm looking for ideas here. And the right answer is there's no answer.
Right.
For a lot of questions. And that's really the unfairness of the interview process. Additionally, sometimes they put something in a job description that people don't want, or they don't actually want themselves, but they just have some boilerplate job description. And you might study all these tools, but someone that knows what the company actually does behind the scenes knows they don't need to study that. Mm-hmm. Or conversely, there's some technique or some knowledge base they're looking for that's not really in the job description, or it's not publicly available, or a bunch of different things. So
yeah, you make some really good points, especially mm-hmm. about kind of knowing your audience. Mm-hmm. You need to get a general grasp of how the interviewer is how their mood is as well, mm-hmm. what they're expecting, how, like, if you're going into a technical interview, how mm-hmm. well do they know the data? Do they know it at all? Mm-hmm. Do you need to maybe give them some pointers here or there? Mm-hmm. Point them in the right direction? Do you need to come to a conclusion? Do you need to mm-hmm. ask a question? These are all things that
yeah. And asking questions to the interviewer is very important too.
Yeah.
As far as like job skills, as you mentioned.
Well, just any old question, or
like, okay, so someone asks you, hey, could you perform, analysis that shows that our product is more valuable than X product, or where we're lagging, or whatever. Sometimes you have to ask, like, do I have this column of data? Is this column reliable? Like, are we missing a lot of values in this column? Like, is this analysis even possible? Like, you don't have to ask, is analysis possible, but ask like clarifying questions. And also sometimes you want to also communicate while you're trying to solve some problem. This is more like a programming thing, but it's also, I'm sure, true for dashboards. From what I remember, like actually interviewing people about dashboards, is people talking out loud about like, here's why I did this versus this. If you're showing a portfolio project, for example. But if someone shows you, hey, here's some visual I have or some analysis, asking people questions about that analysis can give you ideas for why they did it and for your suggestions on how to improve it. Mm-hmm. If it's a question like that.
Mm-hmm. I gotcha.
Yeah.
Real quick, Joel, Drew, do you guys have any questions for Michael? We've kind of been you've kind of been letting us lecture here for a little bit. But
ask literally anything.
Yeah.
Or nothing, whatever you
want.
So
I do have one question. I know you talked about marketing campaigns, and I wrote down a question here. Mm-hmm. How do you measure the impact and effectiveness of a marketing campaign and to make data-driven optimizations?
So that's not easy because it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Is it getting a certain click-through rate to get people to a website? Is it getting people to get to the website and sign up for something? If that's like an ad campaign, is it increasing SEO or capturing keywords? Is it having a marketing campaign that gets X number of people to a page and sign up for something in a certain budget? So if initially you have budget X and you do budget Y and you hit, some metric you're trying to achieve, but you cost a lot more than expected, well, those are things to kind of measure. And these are kind of things I'm kind of learning about too myself. And that's one thing that people don't realize. Interviewers themselves are also learning because they're sometimes doing skills they're not great in because there's no one else to do it or whatever. So if you have a good idea or if you have an idea of like, what to do, then often you tell the interviewer. So like sometimes you ask me a question as an interviewer. I'm gonna ask you a question back. So in general, like how would you tie or how would you consider a campaign successful if I'm trying to get people to view a web page, for example? I'm asking you a question.
Oh, sorry. I kind of missed that end part then.
Yeah. So how would you determine if a campaign's successful? How would you show me a campaign successful? Or my boss's boss, for example?
I guess it kind of depends, like what you said on. I guess the first process would be kind of like defining an objective, and it really depends on the objective you're talking about. Like if you just want people to click through and see it, and you're targeting that click-through rate, then essentially you're going to probably ask yourself like, what's the best way to accomplish that? And that could be something like organic marketing or things of that nature, where you display something that attracts their attention and they just click it, as opposed to if you have something where you want them to buy it on the other end, then you're probably going to want to sell the product before they click that link.
Oh, awesome. So one thing I've heard from some people last couple of years, and I've kind of seen this myself, is there's a lot less ability to track people these days. So like it's a little bit harder to kind of determine like
I've heard that as
well, where sales are coming from. So these are also, by the way, things to consider if people ask you during an interview campaign, like, hey, our campaigns are less successful last couple of years. What could it be? It's also about being aware about like GDPR and link and tracking and stuff. You can kind of mention that in like when people ask you questions, because those are important things if you're coming from like ad background. If you're data analytics, you'll come across ads at some point as a domain. So if someone says like, hey, if I asked you, why is this campaign potentially less successful than 2 years ago when you ran it, even though we're a bigger company, mentioning, well, last couple of years, the laws changed, blah, blah, blah. And, this is why potentially this can happen. One thing to mention about when I asked you a question about like how can you determine if a campaign is successful, you have no care, you have some sort of metric, but sometimes things do not go well. And you have to find some sort of silver lining. So, hey, people didn't actually come to our website, but for whatever reason, we got 1,000 more followers on LinkedIn. And that made our future campaigns more successful. Or, finding other metrics to have if for some reason you can't track a metric. So with link tracking or ability to track people less, well, what other metrics could you use? So, and give rationale for why you think metric X is no longer applicable, basically. So I've learned that one as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was a very robust answer to a great question.
Another question here.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess Chat GPT was recently introduced to the public. It's kind of preliminary as far as what impact it'll have on fields like ours. But what are your thoughts on like how automation, artificial intelligence, Chat GPT will have an impact on analytics?
So a couple things. ChatGPT is good about regurgitating common knowledge. And it's not really good at math, for example, or analytics. And sometimes it gives way too confident answers. So you still have to validate whether something's correct or not. What I think it's really fantastic about is like crafting tweets or posts or those sort of things. It's really fantastic at it because somebody's using a template or an email to someone. You can craft a boilerplate email if you have to write a complicated email or something. I think that's really changing and making people more efficient because oftentimes in bigger companies, especially, there's a lot of very repetitive things you have to do or very boilerplate things you have to do. So I think that's a big impact for industry. As far as like verifying and writing a complete article about something very technical, it only regurgitates stuff that's currently out there, not stuff that is current, if that makes sense, or not stuff that you want to write about that's like new or hot or whatever. So
my hope is that artificial intelligence one day will take me completely out of the data cleaning process because that stuff is a pain in the neck. I would love to be able to design some kind of, I'm saying Python, but whatever code happens in the future, something to clean everything for me so I don't have to get in there.
It's going to be hard.
I know. I don't even know if it's possible right now.
I think a lot of the data cleaning tools, or even if you want to go in the ML space like AutoML, they have some use, but the problem is they require knowledge to use and know about their assumptions and what they do with the data. So having an ability to verify whether something's correct or not is so important because oftentimes your decisions and outcomes of your models or visualizations can impact real people in real life. So the ability you always need to have a person to kind of verify whether something's true or not. And models are often too confident about their predictions or about their outputs.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing is it's always having to go back and check the data that I've cleaned and say, did I do this right? I think that's the worst part about the cleaning process because then you start to doubt yourself and you start to get in your own head. It's like, oh man, because once you catch one mistake, then it's like, oh, where's the next one at?
Guaranteed you made a mistake. It's just how bad is the mistake?
Yeah.
And it's always a challenge because there's conflicting goals always. There's doing things fast and good. Oftentimes is kind of divergent goals often. You can't always do things fast and well. So there's always going to be a quality issue with your work.
You ever seen that triangle where it's like cheap, good, fast? You have to pick two.
As like a job, sometimes people want things like cheap, quality, and fast. And there's always some sort of constraint that something has to suffer. So this is also something you can mention in interviews, like is someone asks you like, hey, can you do this, XYZ? If someone gives you some sort of take-home task and it's over 8 hours, let's say they want you to spend maximum 8 hours, a maximum 4, a maximum 2 hours, and it's timed. Well, obviously the product you give is not going to be perfect. So sometimes getting like a very simple version of what you wanted to do just done and then kind of iterate on that in the time you have remaining in the interview process is very important. So like I wrote a blog that got me my most recent job, for example, and the initial version of the blog, they said, hey, take X number of hours for the blog. Well, I spent X number of hours, but I made sure I had, intro, conclusion, a couple of paragraphs, and then kind of, base content there. And then because I want to have something actually completed. So I sacrificed quality for fast. And you might see this other times in interview processes where they give you some sort of challenge on interview, like, hey, can you make this, dashboard, or could you make this, analysis of the data, or could you answer some question? Where normally if you had some sort of question for work, you'd actually spend time researching the question. Like, oh, how would I track, content views, or how can I make more engaging content, or how could I make the analytics process better? Well, your answer is not going to be as perfect as you would be in real life because, first of all, you're under stress or pressure. Mm-hmm. Interviews are not fun always. Some people enjoy them, like me a little bit these days. But you're going to sacrifice something. So just know that if you're interviewing, it's not going to go perfect as you would if you had 2 hours to work on it at home in peace and quiet, no stress, no pressure. So there's always a give and take for things.
I'll give you another example of one of our students who came to us. They were in an interview process that was, they had seen like 9 different people.
Mm-hmm.
And this was not for even a major senior role. This was for an
Mm-hmm.
entry-level startup position at a company. And they had to do like a bunch of unnecessary work. They had to commit like hours and hours of their time to this.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're laughing already. I mean, it's just obviously an abnormal case, but it just goes to show that every interviewer, once again, like we said at the beginning, is different. And so it's just,
and did they get the job or no?
No. Well, we told them, why are you even still trying to?
Mm-hmm.
It's just at that point, it's
work.
It's frankly it's the work, and their company is trying to get you to do work for free, and it's a little bit of a moral gray area there.
And in that case, if it's work for free, I would honestly just post it online as long as you're not going to get sued.
Yeah.
Like, hey, make it a portfolio project, put it online, get something out of it, and kind of move on with your life. Maybe anonymize the data if they send you data or something a little bit, or change the data a little bit to be completely different, and then get something out of it, kind of, at least so you don't waste your time completely. So then you can use it for interview, the next interview, or the interview after that, or whatever. Because some stuff I've done for interviews in the past is online currently as we speak, 110%. So you could probably figure out what it is if you look hard enough. But
Yeah, that's actually not even a bad idea either, because I've been consulting for a little while at this point, and I've had great clients and I've had not so great clients.
Yeah.
And some of those not so great clients just kind of drop off a cliff after a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's hard to reach them. Sometimes you don't get paid all you should have.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it was a great idea. Just like, hey, if you're going to screw me, why can't, I mean,
I've been spraying them because usually these interview tasks should be something that is not relevant for the company. So you maybe anonymize or maybe change, a couple of details to make it more generic. Making things generic is also pretty good for SEO and stuff too, by the way.
Also for just applying in general.
Applying for jobs.
Anonymizing your data to show what you've done.
Yeah, and assuming you're not breaking laws, I mean, obviously do some research, make sure you're doing things legally and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But that is really valuable because, you learn something from it, right? And this might be something else that a different company wants. So I think it's an option. Let's put it that way.
So we've talked about, I think, about every stage of the interview process, except maybe the kinds of questions that interviewers ask. And I know you say that interviewers sometimes ask unfair questions, but I know that you did prepare a couple of questions for Drew and Joel. Drew and Joel, I was wondering if you guys would be interested in getting some actual questions from a real ex-data recruiter. Well, not recruiter, but
close
interviewer.
Enough.
Close enough.
That way.
All right, I'm down.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but then Joel, since you're so down, let's start with you, huh?
So, I mean, these are questions you've probably been asked, and these are really simple questions. So, like, base questions. So, like, let's say you're interviewing for, like, let's say a Tableau developer job or business intelligence analyst. So, like, what tools have you used? Because I'm just kind of curious. Either of you. I don't.
For me personally, I've been using Excel for honestly like the majority of my life. Like just I've been constantly taking Excel since I was like in, I don't know, middle school, high school. More recently, I've also been learning a lot of Power BI, Tableau, kind of digging into a little bit of Python too.
So a question that you get pretty commonly is like, when would you use Power BI versus Tableau versus Python for something? Like, when is Python better than, let's say, Tableau?
I'm most familiar with the Power BI and Tableau, but I would say Power BI is a lot easier for like smaller or medium-sized organizations to use. The cost upfront for Power BI tends to be less than Tableau usually. Power BI, interfaces with all the Microsoft products, whereas Tableau doesn't quite as well. You pay a premium, I think, with Tableau. It does things very well, but there is a little bit more of a premium as far as the cost compared to Power BI.
So something that comes up because I work at different companies is sometimes people have their data in very, very different places. So even though part of our like tech stack is on Azure, like some of our data is in AWS. So does Power BI allow you to get data from AWS or Google Cloud, or like is that possible? Just checking your general knowledge about the tool, by the way.
Yeah, that would be the kind of question that I would say, I will research that and get back to you. I mean, I know there are, pros and cons as far as what environments you can interact with between the two tools. Yeah, so I would probably follow up with the interview on that, but yeah.
And by the way, that's like it's kind of an unfair question in some regards, because those are things you could literally Google, and that interviewer's like just asking a question, right?
It takes 5 seconds.
It takes 5 seconds to Google, and there's always some sort of, problem that someone else has probably had with that like there's been a solution.
I will tell you from personal experience that connecting to Azure and Power BI is a complete and utter hassle. You can do it, but it's just
to me, that's surprising because they're both Microsoft products.
Yeah, it's just the live warehouse side of things. I think Power BI just really struggles with live data. I don't know what it is. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was user error. Or
maybe it was a while back.
Maybe it was a while back.
Or using an old version of Power BI.
And I've grown. I've become more.
Yeah. And then, so the other question, because you said you've used Power BI and you've done a little bit of Python, and for an interviewer who's not listening to you, a question you might get is, so how do I integrate my visualizations from Power BI? Sorry, how do I integrate my Python scripts into Power BI? Is that something you've done before? Is there proof you've done that, or how would I do that, or is it even possible?
Personally, I haven't worked on that aspect of it. Not sure if Hunter or Drew have.
Yeah, I haven't. I actually haven't done that either. I'm not super experienced with Python either. I think I'm probably in the same realm of SQL knowledge as Drew and Joel are right now, where it's very entry level. We just got into it kind of deal. And so from a technicals perspective, I don't think that just no experience with that.
Yeah, and that happens. So just FYI, some people have some ML scripts that they integrate into Power BI from Python. But these are the type of things people get asked that aren't necessarily fair. But if you see people ask questions on I should preface this, I should rephrase this. Sometimes before interviews, it's also good to go on Glassdoor and see what people ask. Often they ask the same questions, and people post about it in Glassdoor previously, especially if it's a bigger company. So that's something I asked years and years ago, back in the Stone Age, and that was a question I got about Tableau and of course back then it was a new feature. So and then final question, and this is I've asked a lot of random seemingly useless questions, but is there any sort of personal project anyone's proud of that you'd like to show or present, and tell me the kind of value of it, really, because maybe it's useful for my company, whatever I do.
Joel, do you have a project that you wanted to pull up? Just readily, I know it's kind of on the spot, but
I don't have anything to present, but recently I worked with a multi-million-dollar company to really help them find data insights that they were not uncovering. A lot of their data was all just manually entered, and it was like a large, facility where everything was just manually entered, and they needed Power BI dashboards to really show, their CEO and their CFO insights. And just incredibly powerful when you can give them that data and show them what they're missing.
So, like, what were some of the problems with the manually entered data? As Hunt mentioned, sometimes you have weird stuff manually entered data, or you have data processing issues or whatever.
One of the big problems was like the date tables. Like if you're familiar with like the scaffolding and like creating like a separate date table to kind of interface with the rest of the data. Power BI tends to have some issues with that. So you have to create a table to, get it to really, sync with the data.
Relationship problems.
Dates are always a problem, I would say. I was just kind of curious. And these are sort of things that you can mention like in interviews, by the way. So if someone's like, oh, it's a problem, like insights. So like take me through the process of it. Well, I got the data and it was hand-entered data. So the accuracy sometimes not perfect, or I had to reformat the dates. And then like, what kind of insights did you share? Well, what were the insights basically? These are just advice, by the way. I'm not perfect in any regard in any way, shape, or form, but more details is probably better while still preserving like client confidentiality. So sometimes maybe it's like, hey, people were manually entering in hours for work, let's say if it was an HR kind of thing. And I had to clean up the data and I wanted to see how many hours people were working on average, whether we have to give them healthcare if they're working over a certain number of hours, whether we're accidentally giving people overtime when we don't want to, or maybe we're not giving people enough overtime. Like whatever it is, you like share like kind of like the results and the value provided, basically. So
yeah, just quantify stuff. Like when you were talking a lot about. It was good that you were talking about how they record the data, how it was presented to you, and who you were working with, which was the CEO and CFO, C-suite level.
Yeah.
But more about like, what maybe some of the specific findings were, not using like names or anything, but just like, we found that they were misattributing $100,000 of overtime cost or something like that. Because we did create, Joel, if you remember, we did create an overtime cost dashboard for them. This was when we were working with a company in Silvertone. And Joel was a part of that. And so that was something that we created. And so I would say, like we were saying with iterating on things, maybe just going back and checking the old work that you did as well, just refreshing your memory on that stuff. Michael, you're gonna have to repeat that question because we were getting the good old
spottiness. So
it's happening. It's still happening right now.
Okay, sorry.
And the only reason I'm insisting on it right now is because we were at like a good place for me to just cut it and go to where you answer.
Yeah. Sorry. Wasn't my.
Not quite. Still getting there.
Let me tell you about my travels. And kind of making a little bit of money on the side while interviewing outside of Intel. And one big thing I kind of ran into was I wasn't at a company for a long time because Intel's having problems. And Intel didn't quite announce layoffs yet. And so one thing I kind of learned was if you're like, hey, why are you looking for a job? You haven't been at a company a long time. I could have been like, one thing I learned to kind of say was, well, if you've been following the semiconductor industry, you know that, earnings are down and that will affect various things throughout the company, or that is affecting our competitors. I think it might affect us in the future, or without breaching confidentiality. I kind of learned have a narrative for your career about why you're doing X or why you're doing Y, or essentially like education or boot camp or whatever it is to get another job, is kind of have a narrative for that. It was very valuable for me.
Nice.
I want to stick around Intel and get a pay reduction.
Nice.
Or get laid off.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, well, specifically at Intel, they've had a lot of hardy competition from
AMD
and a little bit from NVIDIA, but not really. Really, AMD is the company that's coming up right now, because nobody wants to pay $1,000 for a CPU or a GPU. They just want to go get a GPU or CPU that gets the job done, and not lose an arm and a leg for it.
Yeah, and at the same time, semiconductor industry has been trash lately, so it's everyone too. But Intel's lost market share.
Also, before anything gets screwed up again, your camera is like good and your audio quality is good.
Okay, awesome. So, sorry, everyone. Yeah. So, going back to the HR thing, I know this wasn't your days that you're working on probably, or same sort of type or anything, but you can mention like the value provided was, let's say it was HR, would be that you basically make sure you paid people the overtime they're legally need to have, or making sure that people enter their hours in correctly. If it was HR data, you can also say like make sure our employees are actually legally working for us, making sure they're actually alive in some cases. I've actually heard this one before, where someone does some basic analysis of enter data for like hours, and that employee ID was been used for eons essentially, and the employee was there like 110 years old. So people were entering hours for someone else. In some cases, people that were currently not living. So there's a lot of like interesting narratives you can say without, saying the name of the company or what you're doing, and talk about the value. Like, oh yeah, we prevent fraud in some case, or we mentioned that like we realized that their budget was off, or they weren't tracking something, or we brought profit, or certain products were bringing a lot more profit, or a product, even though it was a loss leader, actually ended up bringing more money to the company, whatever it is. So,
yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And the legally dead thing, by the way, that's actually real.
I can't believe that.
Yeah. Someone was actually dead, like dead for years too. Now I'm talking about a couple of years. So like looking at somebody's analysis, you find things you're not looking for. And somebody's bringing that to people is really important.
and that would be a great thing to bring up in an interview. It's like, hey, I tracked down a dead guy at this company. And they were like, and then it's like, what?
And then we're paying someone, and that's depending on where you are, jurisdiction, what country, whatever. That could be either loud or legal, or there's some fraud in our company, or we paid someone that we fired years ago. Or we didn't pay someone. Like there's a lot of things for like HR that's kind of interesting, but even like products, like showing analysis, like what sells, what doesn't, is very useful depending on what you're doing with your data. Yeah. What kind of data do you have?
And also once you're done working on a project, talking about the actual impact it made, what just happened, what happened for the company, just be well-rounded with it, make it a full story. It's got a beginning, middle, and end.
Exactly, and that's a beautiful way to say it.
And the post credits, if necessary, if you want to get it like that. But yeah, cool. So, Drew, Joel, do you guys have any other questions for Michael? We're going on a little over an hour now.
I do not at this time.
All right, seeing none.
And thank you so much for letting us talk. I know you're on the call for a while and we're talking mostly to each other, and in some cases me going on a rant or ramble. Really nice chatting and meeting you, both of you, as well as Hunter. We've known each other for a while, but
yeah, we're old chums.
Yeah,
a couple salty dogs out in the data industry. Oh man, but okay. So once again, to all three of you, thank you guys for coming on. It's been a really great conversation we've had. I hope you guys have found this as informative and pleasant as I have. Michael, for our listeners who want to reach out to you, best way on LinkedIn?
LinkedIn's great. Twitter's fine as well. Anywhere you can safely reach me, feel free to do so.
All right, perfect. So for those who are listening, I will have edited this video, but Michael, the little lag that he just had at the end here has been happening the whole time. But it's okay. It's not his fault.
And that's why I'm grateful for the three of you for putting up with it. Thank you so much.
No problem.
No, I'll put up with you anytime. But once again, hey, seriously, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you everybody for listening. And we'll see you in the next one.
All right, bye everyone.